You were first elected to Parliament in May 2015.
Yes.
Now, you've made a statement to the inquiry. We don't need it on screen at the moment. The reference for lawyers is WITN 77120001, and it's available to all who would like to see it on the inquiry website. Prime Minister, I'm going to start by looking at two documents, two letters that were sent by the then Paymaster General, addressed to you, although you may not actually have seen them, in 2020. So if we could please have Lawrence on screen, EIBS 40706. And we can see the date of the letter is the 13th of July 2020. It's from the Right Honourable Penny Mordaunt MP, who was then Paymaster General, addressed to you, Dear Rishi, and she explained the capacity in which she's writing, sponsoring Minister of the Inquiry, to update on progress and commitments the government has made. And then if we just look at the heading, under the heading Funding the Inquiry, you'll see from the letter she's raising three matters: funding the inquiry, financial support, and then when we go over the page in due course, compensation. I just want to flag up, if I may, and ask you about what's said under the heading Funding the Inquiry. There's reference to public commitment to support the completion of the inquiry's work, and then Ms Mordaunt said this work remains urgent for many victims. Justice delayed is justice denied, as the fallout from this tragedy continues to claim lives. Now, just pausing there, Ms Mordaunt told us, as the letter indicates, that she was aware that people were continuing to die. And it's obviously the case that it follows from this letter that your officials would also have been so aware. Do you know whether that's something you were aware of at the time, that this wasn't just a matter of an historical injustice, but that people were continuing to die and to suffer, as indeed they do to the current day?
Well, just before I address that specifically, if I might start by saying that I believe what has happened has been an appalling scandal. I think thousands of people, obviously many in the room today and others that the Chair referred to who are watching, have suffered for decades. And they've suffered a layer of injustices, in fact. And it hasn't just affected those people who have been directly impacted and affected, it's affected their families and friends and carers as well. So it goes far beyond those who are directly impacted. And as you just said, this is not just about historic wrongs. People are suffering and being impacted today. And I believe every 4 days someone tragically loses their life as a result of what has happened in the past. And as I've been reading the testimonies of those involved, affected and infected, it's been a very moving experience for me, and I commend everyone who shared their testimonies for their bravery. It can't have been an easy thing to do, but has enabled this important work to take place, and indeed I'm pleased to be able to be here to contribute to that important work. With regard to the letter, as is entirely normal, it would have been dealt with and was dealt with by officials. It's not a letter that I saw personally at the time, but again, that is not unusual given the volume of correspondence that ministers, particularly senior ministers like the Chancellor, receive. It would be entirely normal that those letters would be in the first instance dealt with and triaged by officials. And in this particular instance, my understanding is that there was communication between the officials at the Treasury and indeed officials at the Cabinet Office who worked for Penny Mordaunt at the time.
But although the letter didn't come to your attention for the reasons that you've explained, and which echo what we've heard from other ministers in terms of the filter process in relation to correspondence, do you know whether you had any awareness or whether there was any broader awareness within the Treasury or within government at the time about the point that Ms Mordaunt was making here, that people were continuing to die? Was that something you can recall being aware of at that time?
Not something that was brought specifically to my attention that I was involved of. There were three topics raised in that letter, which over the course of the following months were all dealt with substantively.
We'll pick up on what happens over the course of the following months. Just looking then still at the highlighted passage on the screen. Justice delayed is justice denied. More broadly, do you understand and accept the point that Ms Mordaunt was making there, justice delayed being justice denied, and how delay itself can compound injustice in this context, the infected blood context?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, this appalling scandal has gone on for decades. I mean, people have been let down for decades by successive governments. People raised concerns. They were batted away and told nothing was wrong, nothing to see here, that wasn't right. People thought that they were being helped when, in fact, as it turned out, they were being harmed. People asked for an inquiry. That was rejected before it was finally accepted. So I think over a succession of not just years but decades, justice has been denied to people. They haven't received the recognition that they need and deserve, and that's why I'm so pleased that the inquiry was established, that it's continuing its important work and hopefully will conclude soon, and the government is committed, and I'm committed to acting as swiftly as possible.
And we'll come back to the question of government action. If we just go over the page to what Ms Mordaunt said about compensation, so you'll see the heading compensation for victims. She says in the second paragraph, second line, I believe it to be inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. The costs are likely to be high, and then there's reference to the Irish model. I believe we should begin preparing for this now before the inquiry reports. My officials are working with DHSC colleagues to consider approaches to compensation. Any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. And then she says, experience of other inquiries suggests that early action could save the government significant legal costs, as well as provide victims with compensation as soon as possible. Now, in relation to that sentence I've just read, you'll see Ms Mordaunt there identifying two benefits to early action. The first, a potential financial benefit to the government, and then the second, the provision of compensation to victims as soon as possible. I will come back later to this phrase, as soon as possible, but what Ms Mordaunt explained and accepted in her evidence was there she was looking at the question of what was the morally right and just thing to do. Would you accept that?
Well, obviously, Penny could best answer questions about what she was trying to get across in the letter. As far as I can see reading it now, there were three topics that she raised of substance. The first was continued funding for the inquiry, which has been delivered on with over £125 million to date being spent on the inquiry to make sure it could do this important work. The second was resolving an issue about parity of treatment between those impacted living in different parts of the United Kingdom. And again, that was resolved in spring of 2021 whilst I was Chancellor, with the provision of an extra £175 million of funding to do so. And the third topic was around compensation, where since that letter was written, interim compensation payments have been made to around 4,500 people, and as people are familiar, £100,000 each. There's a figure mentioned in here. Obviously, to date, over £500 million of those payments have been made. And as the letter itself says, any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. And there's further detail about how Penny envisaged that might happen. Obviously, lots of things have evolved since that letter, not least we've had Robert Falls, the Chair's interim report, but also Robert Francis's report, which have a variety of suggestions which are slightly different to those mentioned in this letter. But again, they've been delivered on. And I think Penny Mordaunt herself said the three topics that she raised, all of which she was able to progress.
Yes, and obviously my questions are going to focus on the issue of progress in relation to compensation. Would you accept, and this is a question really about the position of the government as opposed to your own, because you didn't see the letter at the time, as you've explained, but would you agree that this letter indicates that the government was on notice back in 2020 of the likelihood, Ms Mordaunt uses a stronger word, inevitability, of the government needing to pay compensation?
Yes, what I'd say is, obviously, in my role, it was not something that I was directly involved in, because these costs were not, or those forecasts had not been crystallised at that point. The inquiry had been established, it was doing its work, there had been no interim reports from the inquiry, and it wasn't my direct departmental responsibility in the way that it was Penny's, as she would be the responsible minister for it. It wasn't something that, as I said, I was directly involved in at the time, and I think probably because the work was still ongoing and it hadn't reached a point where those decisions on compensation had yet to be made, or any advice or recommendations from the inquiry or others had at that point not been made either.